Alrighty, well, Dr. Jang, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You bet, you bet. So if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, the kind of academic work you've been doing in your past?
Absolutely. So my name is Seulki Rachael Jang, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Oklahoma. I do study employee health and well-being, especially with the three main themes: helping behaviors in the workplace, cross-cultural differences, and gender differences. And there are a lot of ongoing studies, probably about 10, and I don't have time to explain everything, but the things that I'm really passionate about recently are the impact of COVID on employee health and well-being.
Fantastic, fantastic. So one topic that you also specialize in is the phenomenon of burnout.
Mm-hmm.
So if you wouldn't mind giving us a description of what is burnout, how do a scientist define burnout?
Yeah, so definition of burnout is really important, and actually, brought a former definition of burnout. So it's a state of mental and physical exhaustion caused by one's professional life. So that's the definition, like pretty well known. And when we think about burnout, there are different aspects, different dimensions, and different researchers create different dimensions. But the one that is popularly used now has three aspects, three different sub-dimensions under the big umbrella of burnout. The first one is emotional exhaustion. So you get emotionally really exhausted, so that's the first dimension. And then the second one is depersonalization. So in other words, cynicism. So if you feel very negative about things, and especially about toward other people, then you can guess that someone is burned out. So that's the second dimension, second characteristic of burnout. The last dimension, the third dimension, is lack of personal accomplishment or declined feeling of competence and accomplishment. So if you experience the three different things, probably you are experiencing burnout. So those are the three main dimensions. But other researchers also propose different sub-dimensions under the burnout. If you're interested in those different dimensions, happy to share the information via email.
You bet. No, I'd love to dive into that. But before we dive into more of the details of what burnout is, you might just give me some background on what made you interested in studying it?
Absolutely. So I'm from Seoul, South Korea, and when I was growing up, I witnessed a lot of people being burned out, being exhausted, especially from long work hours. So unfortunately, Korea has been number one country for suicidal rates. A lot of people are experiencing a lot of stress. I think work situation is better now, but back in those days, especially when I was growing up, people work from like 9 a.m. to maybe like 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. So it was pretty intense. Even as a student, I went to school by 7 a.m. and stayed there till 11 p.m.
Oh, wow.
So it's a very crazy work, intense culture.
11 p.m., wow.
Yeah. So I saw a lot of people experiencing burnout, and some of them even committed suicide, and that really personally hit me, like hearing stories like that. So I wanted to really investigate what really causes burnout and stress, and how can we really prevent those. So those are the main reasons why I got really interested in employee health and well-being, including burnout.
Gotcha. Now to dig into some of the concepts within burnout, I'm curious, how does a scientist operationalize that definition? For example, you mentioned the aspect of cynicism.
Mm-hmm.
How does a scientist make an objective metric of that sort of?
Yeah, so scientists are trying to do our best to generate good scales to measure burnouts. So there are different scales out there, and some of them work better than others in terms of like statistical analysis-wise. There are various measures, and I don't think some are better than others. And so some of them have a relatively short items in a scale. Others have like a long item scales. And my go-to measure is called OLBI measure, and it tries to measure the level of emotional exhaustion and level of disengagement. And it's 16 different items that are trying to measure level of engagement and emotional disengagement and emotional exhaustion. So we're trying to develop the best way to measure burnout, but again, like all the psychological concepts are somewhat abstract, so we cannot capture like the entire construct of it, but try to at least like capture the essence of it. So yeah, if someone asks me like what measure you want to recommend to measure burnout, yeah, that's the measure that I'd recommend.
Gotcha. So how did scientists come to that sort of conclusion? Because I can imagine there might be some challenges, right? One challenge might be if somebody's like really burnt out, they might feel so burnt out they don't want to participate in a study and so forth. So how did that metric come to be kind of solid?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when you conduct research, obviously we need participants to test our hypothesis. And in that selection of gathering participants, like recruiting participants and ask them to take surveys, there are some selection biases. So people who decide to take the survey are going to, represent the data and provide the stories. So we can always ignore the fact that people who are exhausted, really burned out, may not participate in the study. So we always need to keep that in mind. Yeah, but for now, like there is no really a way to include those with burnout, because we cannot force them to take a survey, by IRB and everything.
Right.
But it looks like in company-wise data collection, they need to collect data from all employees, whether they're exhausted or not. They need to collect data from all employees, and employees need to provide data for the company. So I think companies tend to have more comprehensive data in that way. But yeah, again, like the nature of survey, it's usually voluntary, so you cannot force people to take a survey. So it's definitely a downside in conducting big burnout research.
Right. So from your research, what are some kind of classic ways of measuring increases in burnout? What causes people to have really bad burnout?
Yeah, so when we conduct research, we usually use, especially burnout research, we use this theory called job demand and resources theory. And the theory argues that when people have a lot of job demands, like long work hours, abusive supervisor, mistreatment, people tend to be burned out. And also the other aspect is job resources. If you have lack of job resources, so you are not getting feedback from your supervisor, you're not getting clear goals from the organization, then you're likely to be burned out. So the theory basically indicates that we need to have lower job demands and high job resources to have low level of burnout, to combat burnout.
So would it be like a clean, just kind of opposite of those things would help decrease burnout, or are there other things that don't necessarily map on as opposites that help burnout?
Good question. There are other things too. So obviously we want to reduce demands and increase job resources, but there are also personal factors too. Like those are from organizational stressors, organizational factors, but there are individual factors that people can do on their own. But researchers say that people who are like more has like high level of self-efficacy, a high level of self-control over the situation, people who are more resilient in nature, people who are extroverted. Do you remember the big five? Extroverted, people who are conscientious, people who are except openness actually.
Oh, except really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So like all the big five are related to burnout. So people who are extroverted, conscientious, agreeable, and the low level of neuroticism tend to experience more burnout. But I'm so sorry, less exhausted. Like so, it's a negative relationship. People who are less extroverted, less conscientious, less agreeable, and a high level of neuroticism, they tend to experience more burnout.
Okay.
Except, openness to new experience. So there are some individual characteristics and that are related to burnout. If you have certain characteristics like you have high neuroticism in nature and you are less resilient in nature, then you're likely to experience burnout more. Like you're more susceptible to burnout.
Oh, interesting.
But some those like nature, like some individual characteristics are not always set. They can be nurtured. Like even like resilience, it can be nurtured. It can be developed with some training. So yeah, that's the kind of like individual training can be beneficial to reduce burnout.
Gotcha. Is it known why openness to experiences is the outlier here?
I'm not really sure, but I assume that when people are more open to new experience, less open to new experience, it doesn't necessarily affect burnout. But yeah, I can talk about the opposite aspects, the other aspects of ocean personality big five factors. When people are less extroverted, they're less likely to express what they're not happy about. They can possibly increase burnout. Agreeableness, if you're less agreeable, yeah, you're not really agreeable. People may engage in some sort of interpersonal conflict or other things that can potentially increase burnout.
It's probably harder for them to say no and set boundaries too.
It's weird. That's another interesting perspective. So if that's the case, the relationship will be positive. When people are more agreeable, they're less likely to experience burnout. But the relationship is actually negative. So when people are more agreeable, they experience less burnout. That's what I remember. I can double check, but yeah. But anyway, like we don't know the underlying mechanism of why certain individuals are experiencing burnout more, because oftentimes we focus on the correlationships, but like the underlying mechanism why they're related needs to be further studied, like focusing on the mediations.
Gotcha. It occurs to me it might be worthwhile to mention that, so you've used the term negative and positive here, but for anybody listening here who hasn't taken a science course before, you don't mean this in like the traditional way that we mean it, like positive is a good thing, negative is a bad thing. We mean it more mathematically, how do we represent it on a graph?
That's right, So when I talk about positive relationship, especially between A and B, when A goes up, then B is likely to also go up. So one example is the relationship between job satisfaction and job performance. And the relationship is usually positive, around 0.3. So when people experience more job satisfaction, they tend to perform better. So.
Gotcha. So you mentioned earlier the kind of different perspective, an organizational perspective and then an individual perspective. How do researchers try and bridge that gap, or how do they study these things separately?
Yeah, so we're talking about basically antecedents or predictors of burnout, what really causes burnout, and there are some organizational factors, especially from like job demand and resources model that I mentioned, and also individual factors. We are not necessarily trying to bridge those together, but apparently, of course, they interact with each other. So, for example, the company is trying to reduce employee stress and strain. So maybe they're trying to reduce some demands. They're trying to reduce like intensive work hours. Maybe they're trying to have better supervisors, like try to find better platform to provide more frequent feedback for employees, and that's gonna be beneficial for their employees' stress and strain. But there are obviously some individual factors playing a role. Like if you are like, for example, like not a fan of feedback, getting feedback may not be really beneficial for your health. So they do overlap, but in research, we're not necessarily trying to like bridge that. I get to combine that as a way to intervene people's stress, but we are trying to we are aware that like, organizational factors as well as individual factors play a role in manifesting burnout.
Okay, gotcha. And in your research and the scientists who study this area more generally, how do they handle certain confounds? Like it might be said that there are certain cultural pressures that you got to go out and work hard and these things and provide for your family and so forth. So how do those things outside of the workplace that might play a role in burnout, how do those get accounted for?
Right, yeah, so I do teach work and family class, and that's where we met. Work is not only just work itself, but it really affects different life domains, including family and other things. So obviously, like different aspects of life do affect employee burnouts. So obviously, like since burnout by definition is a work phenomena, the work characteristics are really strong predictors. But the family aspects, if you're having a conflict with your spouse at home, that's gonna affect burnout and other things, like other work outcomes too. So everything is intertwined, just like a human life, complex human life. Work and family are really affecting each other. If you are stressed at work, it's gonna affect your quality of time with your family. That can increase burnout, and vice versa. If you have some issues in your home, at home, that's gonna affect your work performance. It's gonna affect your burnout. So we need to really understand how burnout is generated, not just in like work domain characteristics, work domain factors, but also like other life domain factors like family. That's another big factor.
Gotcha. So you mentioned that burnout is a work phenomenon, but kind of, at least the way we use it, just average Joe, we often refer to this when, for example, college students who are really burnt out at the end of the semester or the senior year and so forth. So how does this scientific research relate to the experiences of students?
Yeah. So, students obviously experience burnout, as you mentioned, especially during the midterm and minor. Yeah, so when I explained the burnout as an IO psychologist, I gave the formal definition from the IO literature, like industrial and organizational psychology literature. But obviously, burnout can be actually larger than that and more in a social aspect. So students do experience burnout, and there are different ways to reduce burnout. There are different factors that affect burnout, different outcomes of burnout. But I think the essence, the general phenomena itself is very similar. So for example, in the IO psychology literature, abusive supervisor is a really big factor to increase burnout. Like if you have abusive supervisor, then yeah, you will experience burnout. The research itself may not seem like it's related to student populations, but if you really think about it, if you have very abusive teacher, then you will experience burnout. You can think about that in like slightly different contexts. And obviously we need to investigate the research idea with real student data, try to replicate the findings. But yeah, you can sort of like understand students' burnout in that way.
Yeah, so as you began to allude during midterms and finals, especially, this is a notoriously stressful period, and it seems like you could almost translate as you mentioned, the variable of high work demand, right? It seems that all of a sudden at the end of the semester there's this huge peak of work demand, right? And so, it seems like everybody at university sort of knows this, that finals week is very, very stressful for everybody. So I have to wonder, like, at what point don't people realize this might be potentially counterproductive, right? To put all the most stressful parts of every class at the same time. When someone will want this, is this kind of like poisoning the well of the kind of academic performance people have if you intentionally kind of pile, as universities do with finals week, pile up all the stress into 1 week?
Yeah. I mean, I gotta tell you, one thing that I really liked about the American education system, especially higher education system, was that there are multiple exams, not just one or two. So I also went to university in Korea, and there was only 1 or 2 exams in a semester. So if you actually don't do well in one exam, it can actually affect your grades so much. And there are not many participation points or anything like that, so there was not like a buffer. Yeah. But in the United States, when I took some classes at the University of Minnesota, we actually had 4 exams in my introduction to psychology class, 4 or 5, yeah. So if I mess up with the first one, I still could do well in the following ones and get a good grade. Or there are other like participation points, like lab points instead. I wasn't, yeah, that kind of reduced my anxiety and burnout as a student. So I do like that about the American education system. But like going back to your question, I still know that the final weeks, especially final weeks, can be really, really stressful and intense. Yeah, but I think sometimes like we need to learn how to deal with like significant very stressful situations. And I think like being in college is not just learning knowledge, but also being exposed to different situations, like getting to know people that you hardly met in middle school, high school. Just like that, I think in life, students are gonna experience significant life stressors. There will be very stressful situations. I think dealing with the final weeks can be a good practice for them to experience the stressful situations in life, like a mini, and then sort of help you, like give you maybe some confidence if you do a good job at handling the stress really well during the final weeks. That can actually help you be more resilient and help you deal with more stressful situations in the future. So I don't think it's not necessarily a bad thing, but stress is like a lot of amount of stress can be really detrimental to people's health. So what I want to say here is instead of like changing the structure of the midterm and binary system in the United States, I rather want to find a way to reduce the stress among students, but help them learn how to deal with the stressful circumstances. So when I went to University of South Florida for my master's and PhD degree, we had this like beautiful, like puppy. We had like puppies in front of the library during the final weeks, so people were able to like pet those little puppies, and it was really nice. Like I felt like my stress was all of a sudden like sort of gone. So there are some university level initiatives to reduce students' burnout and exhaustion, like especially during the final weeks. That's just one example, but yeah.
Fantastic, and I do want to get into more of those kind of examples. But yeah, I think that answer makes a lot of sense, and I've heard that argument be made specifically for like medical students and so forth, right? Because if you're training to be a surgeon and so forth, you can have a 40-hour surgery in front of you. Well, you might not be able to take big breaks and that kind of stuff. So it's not, the upside to learning about it is, as you mentioned, right, being able to manage it and learn efficacy from it, and learning to overcome that stress and still perform well, right?
Yeah.
That definitely makes a lot of sense in terms of.
I do want to emphasize one thing, that stress is not always bad. Historically, stress is what made people survive. Without stress, you'd be probably eaten by a beast, and human species could be in danger or discarded. So stress is not necessarily a bad thing, but the reason why stress has so many negative connotations now is that a lot of stress started affecting human bodily functions and cognitive functions. So I think that right level of stress can be actually beneficial for you, but a lot of stress can be detrimental. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Because as students, we learn in the classroom the content that's presented to us, but I think so much of the learning is incidental to the experiences we have. And as you mentioned, right, the stress is necessary, right? If for nothing else, to bring your attention to something that matters to you. In the case if a beast is trying to eat you, it's like, well, you should be stressed out about that, right?
Yeah.
In this case, if you want to get good grades or if you want to perform well at work, some level of stress, right, puts your attention on that, and that seems to be a beneficial feature of that. Now moving on to kind of the future of research and workplaces, what would you say are some of the things that, looking forward at workplaces, gives you the most concern as far as it relates to burnout?
Are you talking about concerns of the organization?
So one example of this would be with artificial intelligence. This is one area that a lot of people are concerned about, right? That people will be displaced, that it will replace a whole bunch of jobs and so forth. Is that one of the areas that you might be concerned with as far as workplace experiences?
Yeah, so organizations definitely do not want their employees to be stressed because there are negative consequences. So obviously when people are really stressed, they're gonna quit the job, so turnover increases. Is that the question you asked? Am I answering the question?
Sure. Maybe I just did a poor job of explaining the question. I guess what I'm trying to get to is you've described so far kind of what the research has identified as stressors. So I wonder if there's any indication that going forward that any of these sorts of stressors will increase in the future. And so what I was kind of alluding to with AI was maybe like job insecurity pressures and so forth. Are there any of those type of things that stand out to you?
Yeah, some stressors are gonna be more. I know what you mean. So some stressors are gonna be more prominent in the future, like job insecurity is a big thing, especially right now. We're about to hit the recession, and just today, the Microsoft decided to lay off a lot of employees. So yeah, job insecurity is gonna be a big stressor for employee stress and health. And also, like, I think some stressors are getting better, like role ambiguity. You know, you can establish really good role expectations, and they can be prevented early on. But there are some factors that are hard to manage, like organizational constraints, especially in a large organization. There will be red tapes, and we cannot get rid of the entire red tapes, especially if the organization is really large. So those are always like some consistent stressors. But yeah, I think that's a really good question, because you know, some stressors can be gone after 100 years later. Other stressors may remain with us. But I'd say some psychological stressors are gonna stick around, like, you know, job insecurity, sense of job insecurity.
So what about the flip side, the kind of positive side? What are some things that give you hope? I'm thinking, for example, there's been some research that has shown that 4-hour work periods seem to be the most effective. Are you familiar with this research, and is that something that
can you explain that?
Well, I haven't done any like deep dives as far as the academic literature. Maybe this isn't this kind of like a pop culture referencing science, and maybe not the most accurate way, but what I've heard is that 4-hour stretches of work seem to be the most effective.
In terms of job performance.
Yeah.
Productivity.
And there's also, I've heard some people consider the idea of companies switching over to 4-day work weeks.
Oh, yeah, I'm familiar with that. So, I mean, there are different perspectives on that policy, and we don't know whether the 4-day work week is gonna work well or not. Personally, I think there are different work types. You know, like there are a lot of remote work now. Like there are like 4 days work type schedule. There are like shift work, different aspects. That's a really interesting research question. But I do think that the 4 days a week can be really beneficial to employees as long as it's really well managed. You know, I think the management is really important. Like for example, like you're working from Monday to Thursday, but then you actually have clients who work on Friday, outside clients outside of the company working on Friday. Then your work is not necessarily 4 days. You're actually working more hours in the 4 days, and then have additional work hours on Friday, and that can make people angry or feel unfair. So there should be like some guidelines, and obviously not all jobs can really adopt that 4-day work week policy. If you work at a grocery store, if someone needs to work at the grocery store,
or like a hospital or something.
Yeah, hospital. Yeah, like they need manpower. Like 24 hours, Monday to Sunday, 7 days a week. So not all jobs can adopt that schedule, but if the job requires, like a job allows some flexibility, like engineer job, as long as you finish your work, why not? Like I think the 4 days a week schedule can work. But again, like if you have a lot of customers outside the company, the schedule may not work. So it really has to do with your job descriptions, your positions, characteristics of your position.
Gotcha. So you began to mention one of the new possibilities that's emerged is remote work, right? Especially after the pandemic. This is something that's become more popular, but I wonder, there seems to be a lot of concern too about things like Zoom fatigue, right? And people that may have felt lonely and these kind of things. On balance from your research, do you feel hopeful for the future of remote work? Do you feel like maybe it's for some people and not others? It can't be generalized, or what is your reflections on the development of remote work?
Yeah, so again, like some jobs can really utilize the option of remote work. Other jobs may not don't even have an option to do remote work. So it really depends on the job descriptions and characteristics. But like you mentioned the Zoom fatigue, and I'm currently working on a Zoom fatigue paper, and we basically collected daily diary data from full-time workers 3 times a day for 2 consecutive weeks to examine what are the predictors or the consequences of Zoom fatigue. So it's a really interesting research, and not surprisingly, many people do experience Zoom fatigue, especially if you spend a lot of time doing video conference calls. I personally do feel very positive about the remote work option, as long as the job descriptions and your tasks allow you to do that. Because I think that job autonomy is such an important factor, especially in the United States, like the individualistic country. Job control, job autonomy are really important factors when it comes to employee health and well-being. So if employees can have sense of control, their autonomy, then I think it's gonna really help people reduce their stress and strain. Yeah, like I mentioned, like the United States, because one of my studies as a cross-cultural study, and we wanted to investigate what job resources are really beneficial for employee health, especially given the cultural context. And I found that in individualistic countries such as United States, United Kingdom, Canada, like job control is such an important factor. If you have sense of job control, you can actually experience a lot of job satisfaction and low turnover intentions and good health. But in collectivistic countries such as Korea, China, and Japan, participation in decision making is an important resource. So if you have if you can participate in decision making process in the organization, then it can actually be beneficial for your health. It increases job satisfaction and lower turnover intention, things like that. So given that binding, I think that that sense of control, job autonomy are really important for employee health in the United States especially. So the flexible work options and remote work options seem to be really important. And also anecdotally, I hear a lot of stories of employees, they're quitting their job because they ask their company asked them to return back to work in person, so there are a lot of ongoing debates about that. But another study that I'm conducting is about some gender differences in returning back to work. Basically, we propose that women are less likely to go back to work in person after the pandemic because of all the home demands they have. And if they return to work less in person, it may affect their career outcomes too, right? Because when you do your work in front of your supervisor, other coworkers, in person, in the workplace, physical workplace, then your performance will be more shown to other people, that you're likely to experience better career outcomes such as promotion and things like that. But if women decided to return to work less because of all the home demands, like need to take care of children or need to do other homework, then they may be disadvantaged.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I'm imagining there's probably a lot of other secondary effects as well. So you mentioned seeing the work being done, but also just being able to see a person, seeing someone in person, right? You're able to form a connection with them, whereas if you just see them as a name on a screen, right? It might be a lot easier to say, well, this is not as good an employer or something like that. So that actually makes me wonder, if in the near future, if there's going to be a problem like a bias, maybe like a virtual distance bias or something like that, where perhaps even for the same quality of work produced, they'll still be favoring the people that are there in person.
I think that's definitely possible. Because the small talks you do in a hallway, do matter a lot.
Sure.
Yeah, so that's why probably organizations ask their employees to return to work, because they think that's the organizations do value those even small talks, because good ideas sometimes are generated from those small talks. So I think that's we cannot really ignore the fact that in-person interactions can generate positive outcomes, like better relationships with other coworkers, more maybe even more creative because you actually have a chance to talk to other coworkers in informal settings. But yeah, I don't know. Again, like it really has to do with the job characteristics. If your job requires like just data cleaning, like data analysis, then you don't necessarily have to be work in person because you do your work and then you can still communicate with other coworkers and try to coordinate things in meetings. But if your job requires a lot of like creativity, like you need to generate some like good ideas, maybe you are a copywriter and you need some brain power from other people, you need to come up with something creative, then maybe in person work situation could be better in terms of job performance. But I don't know, like this area of research needs to be definitely like done more because in the past, before the pandemic, many researchers like started to understand like the importance of or the benefit of remote work, especially in the work-family literature, because people work remotely, people can dedicate more time for their family, which can really increase work-family dynamics. But it was not a whole lot. Then pandemic hit. So people really needed to understand whether remote work would work. It has to work. So yeah, there are more studies now related to the impact of remote work on work performance, on like employee health and well-being, things like that. But yeah, I think we still need to solve a lot of things. Like we still need to understand like what work means and what it can really entail, what kind of consequences can be generated from working remotely, or like what kind of individuals are likely to thrive in a work situation, what kind of job, what kind of positions can be really well done in a remote settings versus others. So there are just still so many things that we need to understand.
Yeah, that makes me wonder about like all the cognitive effects that would be very different at home versus at work, right? Because when you're at work, it seems like it'd be easier to kind of put yourself in work mode where I'm only doing the things that I need for the job. Whereas if you're at home, you have those obligations, but also you might be thinking about making dinner, cleaning, or whatever. Housework might need to be done where it's in the same area, the blurring of the two. It almost seems like that might be putting a lot more weight cognitively on them.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really good point. Dr. Tammy Allen, who was an advisor of me when I went to University of South Florida, she actually conducted a meta study, basically like a summary of like all the published papers on the relationship between like remote work and work-family conflict. So the idea was that when people have more flexibility in their space, flexibility in time, they would experience better work outcomes, they would experience better family outcomes, probably less work-family conflict or work-family enrichment. But the relationship was surprisingly small. It was really small. So it sort of related to what you just said. Not all people do well in remote settings. Like not all people do well because the boundary between work and family become blur, and it can be a really stressful situation. Your kids are knocking on your door when you're having a group meeting with your coworkers. That can be a really stressful situation. So researchers have really emphasized the importance of like psychological detachment, especially if you need to work at home, like you need to work in the remote setting, then you wanna definitely be psychologically detached from work when you are after hours, like you are, like after, for example, you are off work at 6 p.m., then you don't want to think about work after 6 p.m. You want to be psychologically detached from work, so that you don't have to have like accumulated burnout. So that kind of psychological boundary is really important if your physical boundary cannot be established. So we want to always think about that.
Yeah. And I don't know how far along your research is, but you mentioned the idea that it would be strided by gender, that women would be more likely to remain working at home. Have you found evidence for that claim? Or?
So we actually collected data at 3 different time points. We collected data 2022 January, and then late January, and then August. And we're thinking about collecting another data. The data collection has been completely done, but we wanted to see just some general patterns. And when in the first data collection, we actually found the gender differences in returning back to work. So women went back to work in person less compared to men, as we expected. But at the third wave, when we collected data in August of 2022, there was no gender difference. So we weren't really sure what's going on. And then we were planning to collect another data to see whether there is a gender difference in returning back to work. But another interesting pattern that we found was that men reported that they experienced more interpersonal conflicts. During the time. So
interpersonal conflicts during which?
Yeah, it's like ostracism or mistreatment or interpersonal conflict. During the remote work situation.
Oh, okay.
So which was pretty interesting. Still don't know why that's the case, but it has been the results were pretty consistent across different waves. Women reported more interpersonal conflict incidents, more ostracism, more mistreatment incidents compared to women. So I wonder if it's because in a remote setting, you're communicating with your coworkers via email, via video conference like Zoom or Teams. Maybe there are some sort of I don't know, some conversation cues that
Or maybe men are just not very good at remote work compared to women. Maybe they earn more criticism, or is your research shown that the perception, or is it is there
it's a perception.
Okay. That's what I was going to ask again. Kind of, how would a scientist operationalize that sort of thing? How could you study objectively how much criticism a person gets?
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of the criticisms about, especially discrimination, mistreatment, instability research, because we can measure the object mistreatment, we can measure subject perceptions of mistreatment, but the object side is kind of hard to measure, especially if the discrimination or incivil comments are subtle.
Sure.
Right? So we try to measure, we often measure the perceptions, participants' perceptions of those mistreatment, incivility, and discrimination. So I think that's, there should be some sort of understanding for both, not just for one side. But some researchers are trying to understand those mistreatments, more objective mistreatment in lab settings. So they have some research confederates and make some sexist comments to participants and see if participants report some sort of negative emotions or other negative consequences, or show some physiological outcomes. But we definitely need more research in mistreatment. And when we think about mistreatment, there are just so many different kinds now. In the past, when we really think about just the in-person work settings, there are a limited number of mistreatments. But now we are working remotely, that there are all sorts of different types of mistreatment. Even email, you spend a lot of time mailing back and forth with other individuals, and there are some very upsetting comments, or all capital letters, rude responses. So there are different ways to mistreat other people. So there are more ongoing studies too in the literature, with the incivil emails, and what constitutes incivil emails in terms of people's perceptions, and what are the consequences from it. And one of the studies that I like, the study really demonstrated the negative impacts of subtle incivility, subtle incivility, email incivility. So they found that actually the subtle ones are more detrimental to people's sleep compared to more overt ones.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it was such an interesting finding, and I was like, why is the case? And then I read the paper too, when people get incivil, like a very subtle incivil comments or emails, they usually spend a lot of thinking about what does it mean? Why did someone say things like that? So they tend to engage in more work rumination. They can think about it, and they can really affect sleep in a negative way.
Yeah. I have to imagine there's also some element like that you can't report it. If it's really subtle, there's no way to get recourse where the other person gets punished.
Right, exactly. So the subtle discrimination can be really detrimental to employee health, obviously related to burnout too.
Yeah. You also mentioned that there was a research study where I believe you said Confederates made sexist comments. How did that get approved by an IRB?
Yeah, so it's not like a really bad sexist comments, but
by the way, briefly, we should explain for folks listening. Confederates is somebody who participates in the study, but unbeknownst to the people in the study itself.
Yeah, like so basically research assistants.
So
so that study was approved by IRB. So when I went to University of South Florida, one of the faculty members, like she was studying the sexism and discriminations on employee related to people's health and well-being. So I know that she had like multiple Confederates, male Confederates, and they asked participants to come into the lab, make some sexist comments, and try to measure participants' health. At the time I know about that study, but I was curious about that too. And then when I asked the question to the professor, she told us that it's not like a really bad like sexist comment. It is a sexist comment, but it's not really detrimental in people's health. So when IRB usually determines whether the study is approved or not. One of the criteria is benefits and benefit versus harms. If there are more benefits, and if benefits overweigh the harms and overrides the harms, or there are more benefits than harms, then usually the study gets approved. So I think the team did a really good job describing the potential benefits from the study than the harm on the participants' end.
Okay, gotcha. So I guess now getting into some practical tips, from the research you've done, what are some things, you mentioned earlier the variables of things like autonomy in work, right, the less work demands and so forth, but those are things that usually are outside of our direct control, whether they're a combination of what your supervisor does with the operationalize for. So for individuals and perhaps also students, what are some practical tips you could say to manage stress and reduce burnout?
So there are different ways to combat burnout at the individual level. The first one is mindfulness meditation. Research has been shown that mindfulness meditation is really effective to reduce burnout. The second one is physical activity. So it's like, I'm sure everybody knows the positive effect of physical activity. If you work out, it can help you reduce burnout. The third one is, again, like I mentioned it earlier, but you want to be psychologically detached from work when you're resting. So if you keep thinking about work when you're resting, it's not going to help you reduce burnout. So always think about like the psychological detachment and try to be in the present moment. If you're resting, if you're having dinner with your spouse, just focus on that time. Like try to have really enriched time with your spouse rather than thinking about your work, what happened at work. So those are some ways. But also, I want to add that there are ways that organizations can do to reduce employee burnout. So as I mentioned, reducing job demands, increasing job resources are really important, but also there are different ways to help, different ways that organizations can help reduce employee burnout. So there are some intervention programs going on. It can be like more organizational level mindfulness intervention program. Like I know that some organizations have like a meditation minutes. So they have like all employees do a meditation for 5 minutes during the workday, or like exercise like minutes or something like that. Or organizations sometimes offer like a gym membership so that employees can engage in more physical activities in terms of reducing burnout. So there are things that organizations can do besides like reducing job demands or increasing job resources. Another thing individuals can do is to cultivate some personal resources. So some personal resources are innate, hard to change, but others can be, again, like developed, can be nurtured. So examples are like optimism, like resilience, like self-efficacy. Those can grow from training. So maybe organizations can offer like on-the-job training to help employees really nurture and grow this sort of like personal resources. Yep. So yeah, those are the things that organizations and individuals can do to reduce burnout.
Cool. Anything else you'd like to mention before we close out?
So I know that like burnout is something that we cannot entirely get rid of, but there are ways to reduce burnout. And in this difficult time for a lot of people, especially after the pandemic, I hope that this podcast helps employees and even students to maintain positive health, reduce low burnout and high level of job satisfaction, life satisfaction, and happiness.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Dr.
Yeah,
Jang. I
thank
appreciate
you.
your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for
Thank you.